I'm going to start with the question, what does art know? Art has its own mode of knowledge. This idea is ancient, at least as old as the so-called quarrel between poetry and philosophy, and Plato's notorious expulsion of the poets from the city in the Republic. The haunting effect of this famous decision has been an implicit but consistent association of the poetic act with a peculiar, mysterious, and even dangerous sort of knowledge. Moving forward to more recent days, we find Peter de Boller looking at a Barnett Newman painting in the Museum of Modern Art in New York and deciding that the usual critical questions, what does this painting mean, what is it trying to say, are the wrong ones. Because beyond them lies the insistent murmur of all great art, the nagging thought that the work holds something to itself, contains something that in the final analysis remains untouchable, unknowable. He then arrives at the following question: what does this painting know? We too are interested in the murmur of great art as well as of small art, and we want to put the question to text and film rather than to painting. Our question is, what does art know and will not tell us directly? This phrasing may sound like an art personification. Art is not a person and cannot know anything. Only artists and readers or viewers can. But for the moment, we would like the question and the figure of speech just to cross our mind like an epigraph or haunting melody. Against this background music, we can re-examine how we define knowledge. Knowledge by experience or personal acquaintance, knowledge as awareness of facts, knowledge as an understanding of patterns of relations, and realize that art insists, knows that there's more to it than we can ever know about it. It was Henry James who wrote in relation to the publication of Flaubert's letters of the insurmountable desire to know, and who thought in that context that someday or other we shall surely agree that we pay more for some kinds of knowledge than those particular kinds are worth. And it was Michael Wood who reminded us on the occasion of his meandering through James' novel, The Wings of the Dove, to read these words and to think of the knowledge at issue. Once we have started on the question of knowledge, the obvious move is to research how many kinds of knowledge there are, how much work the words know and knowledge are asked to do, and how varied that work is, and to realize knowledge's own dangerousness that needs to be reassociated with the poetic act in order to avoid its reductive economy of exchange. In his preface to What Macy Knew, James writes of the appeal for the novelist of a child's confused and obscure notation of a tangle of adult relations, namely the goings-on of her divorced parents and their changing companions. It intrigued him that Macy should see more than she understood. Small children have many more perceptions than they have terms to translate them, he says, referring to Macy, who has the wonderful importance of shedding a light far beyond any reach of her comprehension. But the novel itself is more ambiguous, precisely because of the strong and multiple valences of the word no. Do Macy's perceptions shed a light far beyond any reach of her comprehension? Well, perhaps not beyond any reach, just beyond the reach we are likely to assign to it. But is that the right reach? The novel is not called What Macy Saw or What Macy Failed to Understand. The marvelous ambiguity of the thing is that we can never really know what Macy knows. Right at the end of the book, the governess, Mrs. Wicks, gives Maisie a piece of information about the whereabouts of two of the errant adults. Maisie says, "Oh, I know." James then writes, Mrs. Wicks gave a sidelong look. She still had room for wonder at what Maisie knew. We too still have room for wonder at what we may know without knowing it conventionally or directly. This is by no means a concept of happy ignorance. By looking closely at the knowledge in question in Henry James' novels, that is often fully available but entirely unwelcome, we come to see how rarely people want it directly, because it takes so much away from them. When, for example, in The Golden Bowl, the wife's temporary safety rests in avoiding a confession, in particular from her husband, her reserve concerns both the compensatory quality of knowledge as well as the economy in which it is considered, in order to accept the excess of meaning in relationships, even if it is deception or adultery. She does not ask, "How could you, and what do you intend to do now?" 1,000 times better than denying and confessing is the fact that her husband does what he would do, and 1,000 times better than to act on the certainty that he deceived her is her will to do what has no reason and is thus free and indirect. She forces herself to refrain from either accumulating or reducing knowledge, and thus to take responsibility toward an absolute and irreducible reality. The reality of freedom, which cannot be made into anything else. Since this responsibility usually manifests itself in our trying to understand, her refraining from talking about it might not only be morally shocking, but also a scientific carelessness. Yet this indeed is part of her lighter and larger but easier form, which does not submerge itself into a specific matter, but by its own power keeps it above ground. She does not add up pieces of knowledge which would destroy her, because they only make up a story of distrust and disbelief. Instead, she is excited by the possibility, richer with every lapsing moment, that her husband would have on the whole question a new need of her, a need which was in fact being born between them in these very seconds. She not only corresponds to him, but duplicates, as it were, her value by becoming, beyond her intrinsic value, a compositional resource and of the finest order, inasmuch as it relates to the incomparable. It is the labor of this detachment, and at the same time the labor of her keeping the pitch of it down, which now holds her and him together in an intimacy compared with which artless passion would have been but a beating of the air. We feel this quality of her as a virtue, and neither an epistemological uncertainty nor a moral relativity. And so we find ourselves perceiving more than we can translate. Since we cannot know it, we have to believe in it. More precisely, we must engage into a willed and systematic indirectness which helps us to actively believe in it. It is only the fear of having to accept something inacceptable that makes knowing so much more acceptable than believing, until we realize that this is just an escape from reality into its reparation. But to actively believe means to believe for no reason and beyond any comparison. To be sure, we can argue whether her attitude is right or wrong, while the attitude itself is of an informative quality. It does not calculate with needs, and yet speaks their language, so as to go beyond the terms of exchange and turn uneconomical relations into the sublime economy of art. Also, this economy is not recorded on the map of social relations. It has a geographic marking called fundamental passions. It demands that we choose for a given potential another one, but not just anyone, so that a difference between potentials and not between meanings can evolve. I feel, I even know, that in this difference lies the multiplicity that resonates in our relationships, without the other being traced back to the one, or the one leading to the other. Since this economy is a form of patience that refrains from jumping to conclusions, and since it is a matter of bringing something incomprehensible into the world, it may well be that it is gradually produced, as Kleist describes it. He is not concerned with uttering an already produced thought, but with language as a means of forming a thought. But, and I quote, but because I do have some dim conception at the outset, one distantly related to what I am looking for, if I boldly make a start with that, my mind, even as my speech proceeds, under the necessity of finding an end for that beginning, will shape my first confused idea into complete clarity, so that, to my amazement, understanding is arrived at as the sentence ends. I put a few unarticulated sounds, dwell lengthily on the conjunctions, perhaps make use of acquisition where it is not necessary, and have recourse to other tricks which will spin out my speech, all to gain time for the fabrication of my idea in the workshop of the mind. Kleist's description of this process is reconstructed by Hans-Heinz Holz on a grammatical level. The use of a causal clause qualified in a dependent relative clause, the separation of the main clause's verb from the subject by an ambiguous subordinate clause, which, only because of this separation, can be understood both conditionally and temporally. And the main clause shall connect only piece by piece with the subordinate clause, and so push on, gradually but irresistible, the production of thoughts. Hence, the irresistibleness is syntactic, for a beginning has to have an end. Yet let us not forget the gradualness with which conjunctions cut things to pieces, conjunctions whose different dependencies and links can by no means be replaced by a string of juxtaposed main clauses. And let us also not forget that the thought which takes shape in language and can thus be expressed with precision is not only assisted by that thought which flares up internally in a convulsive movement and is itself incapable of being uttered, but also by a movement of Kleist's sister, suggesting she wishes to interrupt him, for this external attempt to grab the floor excites his already hard-worked mind even more and raises its powers of further degree. Hence, the end of this modulation is unexpected and sounds like a beginning. The dialogue between the interior and the exterior takes on the character of a citation that is released from every form of perspective, whether it be conscious or unconscious. Indeed, there is a dim conception as a point of hallucination in Kleist's thinking, and indeed, in the striving of his innermost being after enlightenment, he gazes into the lamplight with the brightest point. Yet, by doing so, he realizes no other persons or things than the words themselves. Yet these words are conjunctions that are activated into relations. They are then varied without varying the conceptions themselves. For ultimately, it is the circumstances, actions and affects which allow the relations to change. It is in this experience that art finds its right. It reintroduces that splitting between language and speech which, faced with a still undefined horizon of references, constantly establishes new relations. Slackening as well as quickening, they take off beyond what can be defined as knowledge. It is the transition from the restrained demonstration of subjectivity to the possible presentation of time in free and direct discourse. It has long ceased to be an issue of the successful or unsuccessful translation of a conception into language, because the gradual production of thoughts whilst speaking has to do with the montage of clauses in language. The conception which triggered everything is ultimately reformulated in the desire to find a representation for it. For it is not we who know things, but preeminently a certain condition of ours which knows. Kleist finds its only adequacy in this, in the respective consistency of a condition or state, which is below consciousness and above myths, meshing historical and present-day signs of the world. It is neither metaphysical nor religious, but profoundly realistic and even quotidian. Lacan's observation that it, ça, only possesses reality in language, that it is in itself language, is useful here. It is certainly not a psychological reality whose expression might be language, nor is it an inaccessible and unarrestable stream of consciousness. From both the interior and the exterior, it assists us in the third person, and with it we arrive in the double reality of discourse and art. This is the multiplicity which resonates in all relations and gives them a new direction. It dissolves what happens in language into what is gestural in language, setting it in motion with the aid of ever few words of embellishment and ever finer syntax. It dares its experiment in constantly different contexts and setups. It maybe shows a poverty of imagination, but it is a way of looking the world's complexity in the face.